Welcome to Text, a podcast of the Mount Juliet Church of Christ, where we encourage and equip people to interact with the biblical text. We are your hosts, Tim Martin and Brian LeMasters.
Not to scare you, but I may sound a little different today. We tried pushing off this episode for a week, but I still kind of have a little bit of a cough here, so you'll just have to bear with me. I know I don't sound or look as pretty, so. For this series, we're going to continue the one they call Christ, but last week, we looked at the death of Jesus. The week before, we really looked at the theology of the crucifixion. Mm-hmm. Then we looked at the events, leading up to that and surrounding that. For this episode, we want to look at Jesus outside the Bible. What do we have for the testimony? What kind of evidences? What things are mentioned about Jesus outside of these four Gospels that we've been looking at so far in this series? So, Tim, can you kind of explain the different types of Christian writings in the 1st through 3rd centuries?
Yeah, there's a lot of different kind of writings, and we even see elsewhere in the New Testament where Jesus is quoted by Paul, for example. But we're talking about things outside the canonical New Testament. And there's several different, types of writings that we see in the early centuries of Christianity. One that we would see, certainly even ones that we're told about that we don't have, are described in the New Testament. For example, Luke says he's going to use all these different sources, that many different accounts have been written about the life of Christ, and he seems to want to get those compiled and accurate for Theophilus. So we know even in the 1st century period of Luke's writing, there were other gospel accounts out there. Now, unfortunately, we don't have those preserved for us today, but in early Christianity, we have a few different bodies of writings, one of which is commonly referred to as the Apostolic Fathers. These are writings that date to the last part of the 1st century, early part of the 2nd century. Some very well-known Christian writings such as the Didache, or the Teaching of the 12, the Epistle of Barnabas, the writings of Ignatius and Clement, and also the Shepherd of Hermas. These writings don't purport to be canonical, but they do have a lot of teachings of Jesus that are repeated in there, some quotations of Jesus that are repeated in there, a lot of teachings and sayings of Jesus included in there. And these books, we know, were read amongst early Christians, because we often sometimes find copies of them bound together or included alongside New Testament codices in their writings. But they don't purport to be canonical, nor have they held to be that way, but they do give us some more teachings of Jesus.
Tim, if somebody wanted to wade into those waters, do you have a recommendation on maybe what they should read first or how they can access those writings?
There's the best one. Now, this is going to have Greek with an English translation beside it, is by Michael Holmes, called The Apostolic Fathers. And I'm sure there's other just English-only copies out there, but his is good because it'll have some footnotes in it and more like a study Bible. For those that want to learn Greek or know Greek, it's an excellent resource to look at some of those words. And each one of the book has a nice introduction to it, supposed dates that they were written, how they were circulated in early Christianity. So I would recommend that by Michael Holmes, but I'm sure if you just typed in Apostolic Fathers in a search, you may find some other English ones. I prefer that because I know it's been well translated by different, and there's introductions throughout the book that are really handy for people to have. But there's several writings there, I think, that really give us a lot of insight in early Christianity. After that, we have a body of writings that's really gigantic, that may be referred to as the New Testament Apocrypha. Apocrypha just is a word that means hidden. And so we have Old Testament Apocrypha. Many people may be familiar with that thought because, for example, if you have a New Revised Standard Version today, it's going to have the apocryphal Old Testament books in the middle. If you have a Catholic Bible today, it would have the apocryphal books. They never held to be Scripture like the Old Testament is Scripture, but they're writings primarily from the Second Temple period, from the end of the Old Testament, the beginning of the New Testament period, that some of whom are just historical accounts, like 1 and 2 Maccabees. Some of them purport to be historical accounts, for example, of Daniel that we don't have in the Old Testament. There's a lot of debate about whether or not they're true or not. I don't know if they're even meant to be true in some cases, but they do give us a lot of insight into Second Temple Jewish thinking. Well, we have the same thing with the New Testament, and there are literally dozens, if not hundreds, of writings that may be in that body. It includes some things that we'll talk about here in a minute. Gospels, meaning other Gospels about Jesus. Acts, like the Acts of Paul or something along those lines, where they're just historical narratives about the activities of individuals. We have epistles, and we also have apocalyptic writings, sort of like what we have in Revelation in the New Testament, several apocalypses, these writings. So we'll talk about a little bit more some of these examples in detail, especially one. Now, some of these are just teachings. They're teachings maybe from early Christian heresies like Gnosticism, for example. But some of them are just, attempts at preserving some sayings of Jesus. We don't know if they're true sayings or not, but they're not recorded in the Bible. Or also, there's some biographical stuff on Jesus that we'll talk about later that's a little bit far-fetched to match up with the Jesus that we have in the New Testament. Then other than that, we have what's referred to as patristic writings or the church fathers, which are commentaries, sermons, lessons on biblical texts by people like John Chrysostom or Origen of Alexandria or Irenaeus of Lyons, Jerome, not Jerome, but like Justin Martyr, and on down the line, Hippolytus, a lot of other people that are making, they don't purport to be canonical writings. They are held by many in the Orthodox Church to be authoritative in their conclusions, and their commentary is held to be very valid. I think they're extremely valuable to us in understanding how early Christians, many of whom had the same native language, Greek, and who lived very close to the time of the apostles, give us some insight into how early Christians understood the Scriptures.
All right, so since these aren't in the New Testament text, like how should we approach them? Like, is there value in any of these different types of writings for us today? Like, how should we feel about them?
I don't think we should feel hostile towards them. For some reason, I think a lot of people get very hostile about it. Like, for example, in recent years, about a decade or so ago, I guess, the Gospel of Judas was brought to light. Now, it had been discovered decades before that, but just like the Dead Sea Scrolls, it takes a little bit of time for scholars to go through something and understand something and put it together for them to understand it. So it's not like it was just discovered, but I don't think we should be hostile to them because they're non-canonical. Because I don't know that they ever purport to be canonical. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether or not they should have been, who decided what was orthodox, what went into the canon, who didn't, or what writings didn't. I had a professor at Heritage Christian in my master's work, Dr. Ed Gallagher, who said, if you think they belong in the New Testament, go read them, and then after you read them, you tell me whether you think they match up with canonical New Testament teachings. And if you read them, and I'll mention some of those things in a minute, they don't align up very well with, some of them don't. Some of them, the sayings of Jesus, they sound kind of strange. They sound unusual. Sometimes they just reword sayings of Jesus in the New Testament. But sometimes they seem a little unusual. Sometimes they kind of like, okay, I can believe Jesus might have said that. And so we shouldn't be hostile towards it. We have to remember there was a strong oral tradition about Jesus that carried on from the time of the apostles, because we know from John's gospel that Jesus did a lot of things and said a lot of things that don't fit in the New Testament, that are a lot of things that he did that we don't have. And so whether or not these accurately represent those things or not is a topic of debate. Many of them we know came from early Christian heresies, where people were maybe arguing about the deity of Jesus and his humanity, or they were seeking, like the Gnostics, some higher level of understanding of God through knowledge and acquisition of knowledge, and some pretty strange, to us, strange sounding things. I don't think it would have been strange to them, but one of the reasons I don't think we can just ignore them is because I believe they were written by people who believed in Jesus Christ and who believed in Christianity and took the time to write them down. I don't think that they were also completely rejected by many early Christians. The reason I say that is, now I don't think they're canonical. I think they were written late. I don't think they were written by the apostles. In many ways, their teachings does not align with the canonical New Testament. But however, they do exist. And many times they not only exist in, say, Greek or Latin, but they also exist, and sometimes they only exist, in translation, meaning in Syriac or in Coptic, or some of the very same languages the New Testament was very early on copied into. And so I think these writings circulated a lot. I think they were read amongst Christians. And so for me, that makes them valuable to say, how did some Christians understand in a time, especially in the 2nd century, maybe early part of 3rd century, without a canonical New Testament that we're so accustomed to be able to run to and use, compiled and universally agreed upon. If they didn't have that, then I can see where some people would believe things differently, and it gives us insight into how they believe things.
Yeah, to me, it's like, it's not weird at all. Like, our Bible classes right now, I know, are using different books sometimes that aren't the Bible. Like, is another book about the Bible that somebody else wrote. And like, that doesn't bother us. But when we go back to this time frame, it makes us uneasy sometimes that they had other writings that weren't inspired. They didn't view them as inspired, but they still viewed them as good or helpful for their faith. Like, so to me, I kind of view them as a similar way, at least in my mind, of like, no, it makes sense that they had other Christian writings. That doesn't mean it, they were inspired. It doesn't mean like, oh, it should have been in the text, like, but still beneficial for them and possibly for us today as well.
Yeah, the apostolic fathers, they're good reading. They're just essentially almost like reading, some of them like just reading sermons or letters from a Christian like Ignatius to a church, to the Ephesians or to the Philadelphians or to the Smyrnans. How do you say Smyrnans? People in Smyrna, the church in Smyrna, that love them and care about him and want to give them the teachings of Jesus and encourage them, just like Paul wanted to do, even though they're not speaking by inspiration. That would like saying every sermon is useless because it's not inspired by God. Now, some preachers think they're inspired by God, they seem, but not ours, thankfully. But it was one of those things where,
I was going to say, you better put that caveat there.
Yeah, I'll put that caveat in there. At least I don't think he thinks it. I'm sure he wishes he was. I wish he was too, because a lot of questions I got for somebody who's inspired. We also have to remember a lot of early Christians referred to these writings, Irenaeus, Jerome, Justin, Clement of Alexandria. They refer to some of these writings not as scripture, but we know in the 2nd century, maybe the early part of the 3rd century, they were in circulation and known. And so they're not just some obscure thing written by one crazy individual somewhere. They were text, as you said. Remember, some people in the ancient world read things just for philosophical study, to just read other people's thoughts. We don't like to do that. We don't like to challenge ourselves mentally here. We just want to read whatever we got. That's right. We got streaming. I only want to read whatever it takes to pass the test. I don't sit around and read Plato or Homer's Odyssey just for the sheer mental stimulation. We only do that when we're required to do so to get a grade. Believe it or not, some ancient people read things just for mental stimulation or to read a broad amount of philosophy on something. So they may have read them to understand, I see why you're thinking this. Let me kind of think through that myself. And so there is some value to that.
Why don't you give us some examples maybe? Let's start with some that are like more out there.
Yeah, and I forgot to bring my one down here. I was going to read you, but I'll have to paraphrase it. I was able to group him, and I'm by no means an expert in these writings. I've read a few of them. I've translated some, but it is something that I'm trying to get into more and know a little bit more about. Because I'll tell you something, I get asked this question a lot. What about the books of the New Testament writings, or Christian writings that didn't make the cut in the New Testament? I get asked about that a lot because it's something that comes up in the news every time something's discovered. And so,
Tim, anytime somebody says they translated a work from one language to the other in biblical studies, you're an expert in my mind. So what you got?
Well, I mean, I haven't translated any of these things, or a lot of these things. So 4 different groups kind of, as you look across different books out there on this, there's one group called infancy gospels, and that's kind of a misnomer, I think, because they don't just talk about Jesus as an infant. They typical, like the infancy gospel of Thomas, supposedly covers Jesus from where he's about 5 years old up until he's 12 years old, and we meet him in the temple in the gospel accounts and going through. And there's some strange things in that book. I was reading through that prior to this grouping, and there's stories where like Jesus turns some mud into sparrows on the Sabbath, and he gets in trouble for doing things on the Sabbath. Obviously, that behavior has its origins in things that Jesus did on the Sabbath that people look at. Then there's another one where like Jesus has created some water. Some kid comes along and messes around with the water, and Jesus drops him dead.
That's the one it's been years since I read it, but that's the one I remember.
There's another one, this kid falls off a roof, and all that just don't line up very well with what we would expect of Jesus. And there's a couple of them where Jesus encounters some teachers in that. One named Zacchaeus, which I don't think is the same Zacchaeus that we encounter in the New Testament. But there's some of the stories are a little bit odd. Jesus is a little mouthy with Joseph when it comes time to punish him, and I think it's interesting to try to fill in that gap, because we don't have, Jesus disappears from when he's born up until whenever he returns from Egypt and goes to Nazareth. Then all of a sudden he shows up at the temple and he's 12 years old.
And it would be crazy if no one ever tried to write things about that
Yes,
time.
that's right.
You know what I'm saying? Like,
and maybe there's some vestiges of truth in some of the things, but some of them just don't fit with the character of Jesus.
Yeah.
But that's what makes it even more interesting to me. Is why would people think that Jesus would kill a kid for messing with him, just so he could bring him back from the dead? It doesn't. It's strange that people would think that. So I'm always a little bit cautious that is there a little bit of truth in every lie? Is there some vestiges or legends about Jesus that have been molded and changed and made? Why would there even be an interest in that? It makes him very human. I will say that. There's also another writing called, I can't even pronounce the actual Latin name of it, but I just call it the Proto-Gospel of James, which deals a lot with like Mary before her birth of Christ up to the time of Christ, and some interactions with her and Joseph, because we don't know a lot about that time, from the time she's told about Jesus till she visits Elizabeth till he's born. There's also a pseudo-Matthew, which means it's not written by Matthew. That includes some time in Jesus' life as well. But some of these do include times of Jesus' ministry. Another group of them are just kind of some different gospels. There's a gospel of the Nazarenes, a gospel of the Ebionites, a gospel according to the Hebrews, a gospel according to the Egyptians, numerous individual papyri that are just fragments or sections of gospel stories about Jesus. And some of these are referenced, like the gospel according to the Hebrews, are referenced by other early Christians. I think the gospel according to the Egyptians only exists in quotations from other works. And so that's interesting to know that it's quoted by other people. So that means it was read and circulated around a little bit in that way. Another, and probably the most popular ones, is sayings of Jesus, like sayings gospels, and what's called agrapha, which means unwritten. Which means non-gospel, non-canonical writings that have sayings of Jesus. Now, we have some of those where Jesus is quoted, sayings that we do have in the New Testament are quoted, like in the Apostolic Fathers, or we have a quotation of Jesus by Paul, it's better to give than to receive. Well, Jesus doesn't say that in any of the Gospels, but Paul quotes him as saying that. So that would be an example of agrapha. Probably the most popular sayings gospel is the gospel according to Thomas. Now, this is different than the infancy gospel that he had. It's written in Coptic. It's probably the best known and most studied of these writings, and it's a Gnostic writing discovered in Nag Hammadi, Egypt. And so this one, I was reading through some of this in preparation for it. And it's just Jesus said this, Jesus said this. It's conversations with his disciples. Some of them read almost exactly like some of the things that we read, the conversations and the teachings that Jesus had, the sayings that Jesus had in the New Testament. Some of them are strange, visionary things where the disciples have visions and they come back to Jesus. Some of the things I could believe, maybe that really did happen. Maybe that's a saying that comes from the oral tradition of Jesus. Some of them are obviously Gnostic in their thinking and strange, and Jesus saying some very weird stuff along those lines. But just because we find it weird doesn't mean that there's not any truth to it. It doesn't have a ring of accuracy. Some of them don't, to the things that we read in the New Testament, like topics that Jesus never touches on. And I think that if they were very important conversations with the disciples, that at least Matthew or John, who would be present, would write those things down. There's another group of, you can stop me anytime, but I'm just going to finish this last one.
Go on.
There's another group of writings that kind of cover the passion of Christ, his resurrection, and maybe the time after his resurrection. There's a gospel of Peter, a gospel of Nicodemus, a gospel according to Mary, a gospel of Barnabas. And as I mentioned earlier, probably the gospel of Judas is most recently been popular. It's not very long. A lot of these things, we don't have a lot of them preserved. It's not like you got 28 chapters or something like you do in Matthew, or a very, very long gospel like Luke. They're not like that. Now, the New Testament will be very long if we put all these in there and thinking through them. But most of them are not very long. But like the gospel of Judas it's strange. It is about Judas Iscariot. I was reading through some of it. Just some very strange encounters between Judas and Jesus, almost like making Judas a little bit more heroic than perhaps, and closer to Jesus, kind of like Peter, James, and John may have been thought of in the canonical Gospels. But we know in the end, Judas wasn't that way. And Judas was a dishonest treasurer, we're told. But this seems to paint him in a little bit more heroic light based on it was only about 15 or 20 pages in the book that I had to read about that. So there's a lot out there. I haven't read all of them, and I hope to continue to try to read them. Some of them only exist very fragments, or in fragments that we have. But it's just interesting how many writings, and that's only the ones we have preserved for us today. There have to be other writings that we don't have. And I'm sure there's some that are referred to that we no longer have extant to us. But I just think it's interesting that people focused so much on trying to either fill in the gaps of the life of Jesus or some sayings that he said. Maybe they took what John had to say about it being so incomplete and just tried to create things. But I don't know. I do think some maybe were created to support certain heresies, if you will. And heresies is an interesting word because somebody decided what was orthodox and what was heresy, and that's a whole nother debate. But I know some of them were made up to support certain beliefs and to propagate certain beliefs. But there is just this interesting desire to talk more about Jesus and his life and his works and his teachings.
Yeah. Before we leave that, anything else you want to add to that?
I was just trying to think through. There's also other literature related to Pontius Pilate and other things that are out there that are circle around people that were involved in Jesus' life. I'm kind of looking through my notes here to see. There were some infancy gospels that are written in Latin that I did not mention earlier, and I probably should have. But no, I think I have exhausted my very, very slim knowledge of those things.
All right. So another area that we can look at when we look at, all right, where's Jesus mentioned outside the Bible, would be secular references to Jesus. So Tim was covering the writings that would be of Christians, like those that held the belief that Jesus was the Christ. Where secular, we would be looking at some that you may hear of pagan and writings of some of these, but these would be of individuals that are not believers. But when they're recording history, it gets brought up. So for one of those, I got 5 to share with us. For one of those, you have Cornelius Tacitus. Yeah. If you're new with us, I took speech growing up, so you will come to see that when I try to pronounce
He may have answered a text.
These names here. But he lived in the 1st, 2nd century. He was a Roman historian, very well respected. Now, it is worth noting, like, Tim was talking about this in our, like, pre-conversations about this, like, there's not as much about this history time frame that we sometimes think there is. So keep in mind that, like, there's not that much information that is out there about multiple things. So when you're looking at non-Christian writings of Jesus, like, there's only going to be so many references that are there. But anyways, he's one of the Roman historians that are known during this time. In his writings, I also think it's worth noting, like, he's not writing about Christ, nor is he writing about Christians. They just only get brought up because they are a character or individuals, a part of the Roman history and situation that he's talking about. So they're mentioned, but he's not writing to try to tell us about us or educate us about us and stuff like that about Christians. So I think it's just important for us to know on that. So he's writing about the time that there's a fire in Rome. People are kind of speculating, hey, this looks a little planned. Nero's kind of feeling the pressure of that. So he placed the blame on Christians for this fire there. So some of his, I'll read to you some of what he said here. It's just a short little bit, but he says, hence to suppress the rumor, he falsely charged with guilt and punished the persons commonly called Christians who were hated for their enormities, Christus, that would be Christ, but just different language translation there. The founder of the name was put to death by Pontius Pilate. He's going to go through and talk more about they're known for their mischief, and stuff like that in Judea. So he's not a fan of them, but he acknowledges, like, hey, he blames it on these Christians who are hated, like, because they're viewed as being wrong or sinful. Like, they're viewed wrong from the Romans, not from a Christian standpoint, like, because they don't accept their gods, and it's viewed as a foreign kind of religious. Yeah,
they're atheists. They're atheists.
Is how they would view that. So, what's interesting about this, F.F. Bruce claims that this is the only pagan reference pagan reference that we have to Pilate. So there's other references like what Tim was talking about, Christian and Jewish, but outside of that domain, he, unless others have come up since his writing, he claims that this is the only reference that we have to Pilate.
I think Pilate was not some Greek, just some Roman hero. I mean, he kind of failed. He failed as a governor. He wasn't governor very long, and I think he got deposed. So he's not like some hero of Rome that's going to get a lot of attention. But
I think it just goes to show like there's only so much out there.
Yeah.
History wise, like,
and Tacitus is no, as you said, I think Will said, he's no apologist for Christianity.
Oh no,
he's just, but he just happens to mention that, and it's interesting that he does. And like you said, the Christus doesn't sound like what we say Christ, but he is writing in Latin, I think, and so how it's brought over into English, I think it's interesting. Like he's not out to prove the case, and I think you said that very well.
Yeah, but what we do gather there is a couple things. One, that there's not a debate about the man Jesus or the man Christ, like he doesn't use Jesus there. Mm-hmm. The man Christ who started this movement of faith that lived and was killed. So like you have that part of there that is there. Now he's not going to agree that he's the Messiah, but but we have
Teslas ain't looking for no Messiah.
Yeah, no, we have that writing there. So another one, I'll butcher his name as well, but Lucine of Samosata, he's writing the death of Peregrine, which is a satire in the 2nd century. And this is interesting because it's not normal history that you would think of, but it's satire in like the way that he's describing it. But he's going to reference the Jews, and he kind of ties, for there's a little bit in time where the Christians are still kind of lumped in with the Jews from a pagan standpoint, almost like another sect of that. So like his reference here is like to the Jews, but also with the Christians. And he's going to talk about Claudius expelled them from Rome, which Luke references in 18:2 there is a reference there. So anyways, not a lot mentioned later on in another type of writing, the lives of the Caesars. He also references Christians in relation to Nero's punishment there. So you have a side note about Christians and Christ, but not a lot of info there that's given to us. Another one, Tallius. This is interesting because Tim had a situation that he referenced earlier as well. So they believe it's dated around like AD 52, but like his writings don't exist anymore. Like we only know of his writings because somebody else quotes from it. So he's not a believer. Like, and you're going to see that in this example here, but a Christian is quoting his work. Julius, cannot pronounce his last name here, but Genesis. How would you say?
Africanus.
There we go.
Africanus. I bet he's from Africa.
Yeah. He says in his 3rd book of histories, he explains this darkness as the eclipse of the sun. So what they're talking about is the crucifixion of Christ, where he's explaining away that not that there wasn't a man named Christ that died, but that there wasn't anything miraculous, that it was just, darkness was caught. Like he even acknowledges there was darkness, but he was like, there's a natural explanation of why there is darkness there. So anyways, in his writings, he goes to like refute that and gave, his opinion about some of that. But then the 5th one that I'll mention for us is Josephus, which is interesting. So the first 4 were not Jewish writers there. But Josephus, stepping out of that, what we would call pagan, Roman, elsewhere, non-Christian Jews here. Josephus would be a Jew, believed in his writings to be of the Pharisee sect, but he served as a translator for the Jews and Romans. You had like the war going on where he ends up getting taken to Rome, but kind of ends up having a pretty good life in what the current situation is like. But ends up getting a good spot there in Rome. And while in Rome, he writes the Jewish War, but also Jewish Antiquities, is his 2 writings. But there's a debate, and we're not going to go in the details of this because for what we're talking about today, it doesn't really matter one way or the other for what we're saying. But there's a debate about whether or not Christians later inserted statements about the deity of Jesus into his writings. So like he talks about, let me flip over to it. Like he's going to talk about things like there was a time where there was Jesus, a wise man. So like that seems very much from a Jewish standpoint of like he's a wise man, like a good man, but not the Messiah. But then you also have later where he'll reference he was the Christ. Well, a Jew that wasn't a Christian wouldn't make that statement or that declaration. So there's other things, but he references Pilate there, and that there's still that following of his today. Like they haven't died out. So there's debate about is all of that original to him or not. There's other writings later on that he also talks about where he refers to Jesus, and it's not where he's calling him the Christ, but that some believe that he is. But he's not making that statement from his point of view. So whether or not whatever Josephus believed, like, doesn't really matter other than the standpoint of like we have another historian that acknowledges his life, he existed, even the narrative that we have of his death and Pilate being like, that was just a known thing that occurred. So the reason I share all that is like, and I'm sure that there's this case out there, but like, I don't hear a lot of debate, and maybe I'm just ignorant to it, but I don't hear a lot of debate of people really attacking that there was a man named Jesus who lived. Like, it doesn't seem to be that way. Most of it would come down to the fact of he's not the Messiah, or he didn't walk on water. He didn't rise from the dead.
He's not God.
He's not God. Not that there wasn't a man named Jesus who existed. Yeah. Tim, you want to add something to that?
Yeah. Did you have something from Suetonius?
I did, but I
think it's a reference to Christians in Rome and Nero's persecution of them. I thought you had.
Yeah, I did. It's just another reference.
Okay. But this is another Roman historian. What you said earlier was correct. We don't have thousands of Roman historians. All these writings, including Josephus, have to be subjected to literary criticism and how old are their writings and all these things. But I think it's 100% accurate. There's even an area of, I would call it theology, this quest for the historical Jesus. Like, what kind of man was Jesus? How did he walk the earth? How would he really have acted? And sometimes it borders on a little bit of heretical teachings about Jesus and denying his deity. But yeah, it is tough based on secondary evidence, what I actually say primary evidence as far as being contemporary to Jesus' time or close to it, but from non-Christian sources to acknowledge that, yes, historically there was an itinerant preacher in Palestine that stirred up a little bit of trouble and he was killed by Pontius Pilate. Does that validate everything else? No. We'll talk about that next week as we talk about the faith that we have in the gospel accounts of Jesus and his teachings and his actions. But it means you can't just dismiss it outright. I think that there's not as much evidence about stuff in ancient history as we would like for there to be. There, for example, what we know about Persia was written by the Greeks. Well, they were arch enemies. And so that's like reading the history of the American Revolution written by somebody in London. I mean, they're not going to
get the history of the one that wins.
Yeah, that's right. And whoever comes out on top, victor gets the spoils. And Napoleon said history is nothing but a fable everybody agrees upon. But that we have this smattering of evidence doesn't sound like a lot. But keep in mind, we don't have the evidence for some of these people that we hold to be absolute historical figures. We don't have as much evidence about them as we do about George Washington or Adolf Hitler or anybody else, or from Abraham Lincoln or whatever it winds up being, where there's a ton of writing and eyewitness testimony that's been preserved to this day. Without Tacitus and Suetonius and others, maybe a few others, we don't know a lot of history of Rome, even though they had a gigantic amount of writing and they had a gigantic impact on world history. There's not as if there's just tons of things out there. So when people look at what you did and you did such a good job in presenting it, well, that's only 2 or 3 references. I'm going to tell you something. There's a lot of historical figures we strongly believe in that we believe existed, and we have about 2 or 3 references to them. So the fact that Jesus walked this earth, the impact of the writings I mentioned and the writings and references you mentioned, the impact of Christianity. It changed an empire at the beginning of the 4th century with Constantine's Edict of Milan. There's 2 billion people on this earth right now that claim to be adherents to Christianity. It's really hard to say it's phony. And if so, Jesus has pulled off the greatest sham in human history 1 billionfold. and his impact of doing of what he did. Now we'll talk about this, like I said, next week. The miracles that he performed, the things that he did, the theological things that he accomplished, and the forgiveness of our sins and resurrecting from the dead. Those are things that we have to take on faith and believe the testimony of the eyewitnesses. There's no proof of those things outside of the scriptures, but that's how God asks us to do things. Faith is the substance of things not seen, and so we have to remember those things. But it is one of those things where, even though it may be viewed as scant evidence, I caution you that a lot of things you hold in your history books that you read in world history in school is based on just as scant of evidence.
Yeah, and I also think that's what makes the Bible so special as well, is that we do have these eyewitnesses and this record of detail of things that Jesus did.
Mm-hmm.
Tim references, but next week we're going to close this series with Tim and I really answering the question of why do we believe? So we went through some of this today in our evidence. We went through this series of the one they call Christ, but at the heart of it, what is it that compels us to give our lives to be followers of Jesus? Like, what is it that compels us to have faith in the one they call Christ? Tim, you got any other closing thoughts?
No, I think this has been a little bit, it's a very interesting study for me to get into a little bit deeper, something I'm kind of interested in anyway, in ancient Christian literature. And so I appreciate your work and to what you've been looking through in there. And I just think it's amazing to me the impact that man had and his followers had on the centuries that followed and the body of literature that exists out there in Christianity.
If you got questions or suggestions for future topics, let us know by emailing us at podcast@mountjuliet.org. To our fellow students of Scripture, thank you for joining us for tech support. We hope you will join us next week.
This is a podcast of the Mount Juliet Church of Christ. You can find more personal growth resources like this one at mountjuliet.org/resources. The Mount Juliet Church of Christ exists to glorify God and make disciples by helping people grow in Christ, love one another, and serve others.